Whenever setting up a new installation or even a new user of 3ds Max, you should go in and change some of the key preferences for the program. The Preferences dialog can be found actually in two different menu items. We can access the Preferences dialog from the File menu under File Preferences, but that's actually a little bit misleading because we're not just setting up the options for a particular scene file. This dialog is going to change the options for the entire program and all scenes. So I'm going to go to the other menu item. I think that's a little bit more logical. It's under Customize, Preferences. And we have a whole bunch of tabs here and many options. Of course, we're not going to do all of these, but just the most important ones. Starting from the General tab, we have the number of scene undo levels. And that is currently defaulted to 100 undos. And that may sound like a lot, but it's actually not, because 3D is complicated and it's really common, even for experienced users, to need to go back 20, 30, 40, 50, maybe even 100 steps to get back to where they were. You can reduce this number if you need to in the case of limited memory. Let's say you've got a system that doesn't really have very much RAM. You can save RAM by setting the undo levels to a lower number, but I would only do that if absolutely necessary. Moving on in the Files tab, in the File Handling section, we have an option labeled Convert Local File Paths to Relative, and that is off by default. However, I strongly recommend that you enable it by turning on that checkbox. What this is going to do is it's going to store all of the asset locations relative to the current project. So to explain, 3ds Max, like most 3D programs, utilizes a project folder structure, and it maintains links between all different types of files. So for example, we'll have a specified folder for scenes, another one for textures, another one for rendered images, and so on. Now when this switch is off, 3ds Max is going to store the location of every file in an absolute path. That is, it's going to store the location of that asset starting with a drive letter or a network volume name. It's going to store the entire path. If the switch is on, it's also going to store that path relative to the current project's root. And effectively, what this means is that you can take your entire project and all the files within it and then move that to another location or change the name of the project root folder. And this is kind of important. If this switch is off and you're only storing the absolute paths, then you can run into trouble where 3ds Max can't find your assets. And we'll be looking at asset management in more detail later, but for now, it's important just to have this switch on so that you don't run into trouble later. Moving on, in the Viewports tab, down at the bottom we have a pretty important section here labeled Display Drivers. This has to do with the technology used to display objects and images in the viewports. And the display driver goes by the name of Nitrous. And we have some options. Basically, you want to keep this at the highest level of Direct3D that your current hardware will support. I've got an NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1080 video card in my computer, and that supports up to Direct3D version 11. The only time you would need to change this is under extreme circumstances where your hardware just isn't working right. So if you see 3ds Max flickering or you have display corruption, any kind of issues like that, the first thing you should do is try to install a newer version of the hardware driver. In other words, go to the manufacturer's website, whether that be NVIDIA or AMD or Intel or whatever. Go to that website, download the latest hardware driver, and install that on your system. And if that doesn't work, then you can go in here and change up the software driver. And to do that, you would go into this dialog here by clicking Choose Driver. And we can actually dumb this down to a lower version of Nitrous, and maybe even switch over to a software driver, one that doesn't use the video hardware at all. You might need to do that in extreme cases. For example, if you're using remote desktop and logging into another computer remotely, it might not work right with the Direct3D driver. But like I said, you want to have this set to the highest level Direct 3D that your hardware will support. I'll go ahead and click OK. And even though I didn't make any changes, I get this warning dialog that tells me I need to restart 3ds Max in order for these changes to take effect. Okay, and finally, we can go into the Help tab up here just to point out that the help documents for 3ds Max are hosted on the Autodesk website by default. If you need the help files to be on your local computer, maybe you're in a studio that doesn't allow your workstation to be on the internet, then you can actually go to local computer network and download the files and install them. I'll set this back to Autodesk website. Click OK. And then when I exit 3ds Max, all those preferences will be stored.